I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News podcast. And we're on location at the Current Trends in Mining Finance Conference put on by the New York chapter of the SME. And I have sitting across from me, instead of over computer, frequent guest, longtime friend and colleague, Chris Temple of the National Investor. Good to see you, Chris.
And likewise, here we are again.
Here we are again. We didn't do this in Washington. We talked about recording something there, and then we decided it was going to be Fed week, and we waited, and we ended up back on computer again, even after being in the same city for a few days. So it's good that we have this opportunity to do this in person. When we talked a few weeks ago, post-Fed, we dabbled about the elephant in the room, and they're always the elephant in the room. We talked about China and their potential effect on future Fed policy, and we decided we should probably circle back, and here we are, to actually talk about China, the state of the Chinese economy, the state of play in China, and what is their possible effect on the West, given the current situation? So, with that in mind, you're off.
Well, every people that have a strong opinion about yours truly will tell you I'm off, and I've been off for a long time. But that's beside the point. Look, China has, in recent days, reestablished itself in the psyche of markets and, economic pundits and so forth as the preeminent low-cost manufacturer in the world. People already have heard, and I've talked about this in a couple other contexts recently, that the Biden administration just either enacted or raised tariffs on a host of Chinese imports having to do with the green economy, whether it's EVs, where tariffs were quadrupled from 25% to 100%, whether it was on components for batteries, for solar panels, or whatnot. And this underscores a chronic thing, that's being discussed at this conference, that was discussed at the conference that we were at in Washington a few years ago, sponsored by the Northern Miner and by the Precious Metals Summit folks, that China, I guess the right way to put it, Mike, is that the U.S., for all of the talk about wanting to build this green economy, the energy transition, whatever moniker that you want to use for it, we're going to have, instead of a chicken in every pot, we're going to have an EV in every garage and a solar panel on every roof, et cetera, et cetera. Competitive-wise and planning-wise, we are farther behind China today as Joseph Robinette Biden is finishing up his term, or first term, however you want to put it, in office, than we were when he started. The U.S. has brought a knife to a gunfight. One of the ladies from the administration who spoke, and very frankly, I have to give her credit for it, in Washington, was discussing about the challenges that the U.S. specifically, in the Western world generally, has had when it comes to mining, when it comes to the energy transition, when it comes to making sure we've got all of the building blocks that we need for electric vehicles, for solar panels, and all of these things. And essentially, and I'm paraphrasing what she said, the U.S. has this agonizing bureaucratic structure where you've got multiple layers of overview, oversight, regulations, and everything before you can build something. And in China, by contrast, they have laid out, okay, here's where we want to be in 50 years. Here's what we need to do to get there, and let's do it. And you don't have to agree with that, because it's been well covered that one of the consequences of that is that China is still the world's biggest polluter. We can pat ourselves on the back that we are not the world's biggest polluter, but another consequence is that being overly obsessed with that, we are falling farther behind in the race for global hegemony now in a brand new area of green energy and all that kind of stuff going forward. Doesn't have to be that way. So, I think that the message has come through loud and clear in Washington. It's come through loud and clear here that we need major permitting reform. We need a major reality check and wake up for our public policy makers and everybody, so that we understand just how far behind we are in this fight. We cannot build our own green economy of the future by making it overly expensive for everyone and just slapping tariffs on China. We need to figure out, and we have the ability to do it. We don't have the will to do it yet. We need to figure out how to have all of these things at a more reasonable cost, so that we have U.S. and allied countries that are building our own green economy, and we aren't reduced to just whining about China and then slapping tariffs on them.
Yeah, I agree. You and I sat through a presentation by several U.S. government bureaucrats this morning, from anywhere from the Department of Energy to the Department of Defense,
Right.
and such. I had two takeaways from that discussion this morning, and neither of them made me feel particularly well. There was the one gentleman, they were actually both from the Department of Energy, but and I will give them credit, they were both kind of being frank about things. But the one gentleman said that, yeah, we as an industry might want permitting change and we can present it to them, and they may say yes, but then they have to take it to the president, who has to take it to Congress, who has to pass it back up to the president, who then signs off and makes it policy. And that whole process could take 18 months.
Right.
And at this point, 18 months could have a new president sitting in the White House, and that whole process could start yet again. So that was the one thing that didn't make me feel overly confident that we could actually beat China in this particular game. And the other thing was that as much as they talk about critical metals, they keep hammering on that we have to be an elite leader in ESG at the same time. Well, part of the reason that China is dominating in these metals is that they are not an elite leader in ESG. In fact, they have a horrible ESG record and they don't care. And I asked the question of this particular individual as to where he saw the compromise coming between the need for critical metals and the demand to be the number one ESG. And he tap danced around that pretty hard, as you noticed, to the point where it makes me think that exactly that. If we're going to wrestle it away from China, it's going to be at a substantially higher cost.
Well, there's going to listen. All of these metals, Mike, in years to come are going to be at a substantially higher cost in the best case scenario, because labor costs have risen, because material and input costs have risen. When you get to the place where you can actually build a mine to mine cobalt or nickel or lithium or copper or whatever, everybody who follows these industries has seen this. If you had a company, XYZ company, that had an economic study out 3 years ago, they just updated it, and together with maybe more copper and gold or whatever, they also saw their front end nut go up by 25%. As far as what it's going to cost them to construct the thing. This is just a fact of life. You've got too short of supply of all of these different things in the world. That's going to keep upward pressure on prices. You've got resource nationalism. And this is a place where still, and we heard this in Washington and we've heard it here to a great extent, the U.S. still has got this, and I used the term recently, imperial hubris, where we think as a country, and we've conditioned, unfortunately, our citizens to have this same hubris. And this is why we don't have enough of a public discussion about maybe we do need to see how the sausage is made. Maybe we do need to safely mine more of these things in our own backyard, because we can do it with better environmental and labor standards than where we're getting some of these things now. We have this idea that we're just going to automatically command all these different minerals we need for the future from our allies or friendly nations. Guess what? Even if we do to some extent, the costs are going to be higher, substantially higher than maybe if we mined them in some of them in our own backyard. So I think that as a country, the U.S. is being very naive thinking that we still have this imperial world where we can command stuff from other places. And of course, and and that brings us back too to places like Indonesia, to the Congo and whatnot. You asked a great question of one of these guys this morning. How is it ESG friendly for us to source battery metals from the Congo, from little kids up to their necks in mud and chemicals, producing these battery metals so that we can feel woke and wonderful about how green we are? Do we not care about kids like that? Do we think that environmental spoilage and abusing child labor is okay as long as it doesn't happen in our own borders? That's another part of the debate that we just don't seem to want to have as a country.
Well, and they seem to have a hard time squaring the equation when they told us that they had to have the highest ESG score, and then the very next slide says, "Oh yeah, by the way, we're getting this from the Congo," and I'm going, "What?"
Well, and then look the nickel story. All right, and Indonesia produces the majority of the world's nickel. Most of it is processed by China. It's the dirtiest. I won't get into all the geological terms and confuse people any more than we might already, but it's the dirtiest possible way to get nickel anywhere on this planet is what is being done in Indonesia right now. All right, the European Union has already enacted legislation that I think it's after 2028, they will not allow to come into the EU any nickel for any battery or anything like that that comes from Indonesia. All right. Now, the EU may be as diluted as we are at times here in North America, because I don't know if they have the slightest idea where they're going to replace that nickel from. They sure aren't going to do it in their own four walls. And this underscores what I said a minute ago, especially if you're going to have any kind of standards at all. And Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, great outfit, great think tank. They follow all these different metals. They've actually come up with the scoring system for price in the world to recognize and with a higher price, nickel or lithium or whatever that's mined in a safe jurisdiction with first world labor standards, first world environmental standards. But if that's not incumbent on everybody, and if, as has happened to date, China can look at that or some other country can look at that and laugh and say, all right, if you want to feel virtuous, fine. Meanwhile, we'll be the ones mining all this stuff and processing all this stuff and selling the cheap EVs. Okay. So now we're really out of luck. So there's, this all happens in the first place, Mike, and folks listening out there, when there was never any real thought and planning that went into this, all of these green goals that we've had in the West, not that there's anything wrong with them, and because I agree with a lot of these different objectives. We need to live more sustainably on this planet. We need to have less of a footprint, et cetera, et cetera. I don't quibble with any of that, but you don't start with that and then just think that magically the pieces are going to fall into place just because of the virtuousness of our position. That's not how the real world works, whether we like it or not.
No, it's not. And it reminds me of a couple of years ago in London when I broke some poor millennial girl's heart by telling her greed would win. And if we needed the minerals, we wouldn't care where they came from. And sadly, I've been proven right over the last few years. Sucks to be right sometimes on the wrong subjects.
Yeah, you've been proven.
I could never be right with the lottery numbers, but this I'm right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was part of the challenge that I had. They were talking out of both sides of their mouth and wanting this, and then and as I say, turning it around and saying, "Oh yeah, Congo's okay," and I'm like, "No, it's not." But that's where we are. Now, our newest issue of the Prospector's out, and we're going to talk. We're going to go down a little bit more down this rabbit hole. We had a very good article by Ryan Blanchette. Ryan's one of our newest writers and contributors to the Prospector. Ryan's background is as an analyst working for the DND in the United States. So I had Ryan look into a program by the Five Eyes, which is a military alliance between Canada, Britain, France, Australia, and the United States. In this particular case, it was four of the Five Eyes had agreed to make 40 to 50 new nuclear subs to patrol the South China Sea. And everyone goes, yeah, that's great, that's wonderful. These particular subs, with all their guidance missiles, targeting apparatus, radar systems, and the magnets and everything that go into building a nuclear submarine, require collectively about a ton of miscellaneous rare earths to build all these things. 90% of those rare earths are made exclusively and processed exclusively in China. So here we are again, looking at the Chinese elephant and the Americans wanting to wrest control. And I have to ask the obvious question: what do you think the chances of China selling those rare earths to the manufacturers of these subs that are going to be patrolling off their coast?
Well, I don't think they're very good. I mean, China already some months back stopped the export of any technology that they are in the lead on of how to most efficiently and profitably process rare earth elements into finished products. It's not like nobody else can figure out how to do it. We're starting to do some of that belatedly here in the U.S. with a couple different facilities. Energy Fuels is one big one that's a part of that food chain. But look, I have said for a while that World War III has already started. It's a war over currencies and commodities. Similar issues have led to actual shooting wars in the past. You can make the argument that every war in the last century, to one extent or another, started with issues over currencies or commodities, or the availability or sale of them, or in the alternative, embargoes of different things. It's very well recognized. Just to give you one of many examples I could, that one of the things that provoked Japan was when the Roosevelt administration cut off oil shipments to Japan. So wars start over stuff like this, and over tariffs, and over these kind of battles of currencies and commodities and things like that. So that greatly concerns me. That said, you've already seen where China and Russia now do business with one another outside the dollar system. Sanctions that were imposed on Russia specifically when they went into Ukraine have been revealed widely as what some of us said they were from the get-go: ineffective, if not a joke. So Russia has been hurt very little. They've gained business where they've lost it elsewhere. So we're at a place where Russia and China both, which are getting chummier with each other by the minute, can look at, again, this moral posturing by the West, thinking that we're morally superior to everybody else, and they just laugh while they build supply chains that do an end run around the U.S. dominant system that we've had in this world since the end of World War II, but which is losing its grip on things right now. So back to your point about the subs and whatnot, China doesn't have to sell us anything. Of course, they could say, well, why would we sell you this stuff that's going to be used against us in warfare? But that gets to a deeper question: is that rather than the U.S. and its allies building more military might to do battle with China, why don't we worry about our economic might at home and take half of the attention and a tenth of the money that we're spending on military endeavors and build the kind of economy that we need to get us off of China once and for all? Because we've not done that. As I said a few minutes ago, we're farther behind on all this stuff than when Biden was elected. And this, EVs and all this, that was supposed to be his signature accomplishment. And it's been horribly, criminally mishandled, in my opinion. So where we're not any farther ahead, certainly in competition against China, than we were to start. So I don't like it from an economic, common sense, and a world peace standpoint to see the attention being made on trying to cajole or bribe Japan and South Korea and Australia, and we're going to ostracize all of them from China. They're all a lot closer neighbors than we are to China. And instead of doing that, why don't we, in a more high-minded and more I don't know what the right word is, but I just say in a more high-minded and honest way, let's honestly compete with China.
Well, you've got an administration that says that you can't compete with China. And it's similar to to Canada. We had a prime minister when he was in opposition lament that we become a petrodollar. And that was one of the things he was going to make sure that they decoupled the Canadian dollar from the price of oil. And I guess he's successful because we have high oil prices and a very low Canadian dollar. But the message, and Canadians missed the message, was that Canada sucks and you can't compete unless we devalue the dollar. And we were competing quite fine with a Canadian dollar that was sitting at par with the United States. And all it did was put inflationary pressures on the Canadian economy because the buying power of the dollar keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking when everything else in the world is priced in US dollars. And when you know, we measure ourselves against that, it becomes hugely problematic in the way things are. And essentially, that's in my mind when they keep slapping tariffs on China, they're saying, well, we can't compete, so take that.
Well, you've got that, and then not to get too far afield, and there may or may not be more opportunity to talk about this in the months ahead, Mike, but it has given rise, this very same thing you're talking about, to efforts in the US to rein in or somehow bring the Fed to heel. One of the more interesting stories in our own media here in the recent past was that some purported advisors in Trump's inner circle are crafting a plan where if he were elected again, that he would be able to basically circumvent whatever the Fed's monetary policy is, whether it's to have a veto of Fed policy or the Fed would be able to stop a rate hike or something like that. And this would really get interesting from both the currency and commodity standpoint, because I try to get people to understand way back when Trump was first elected that he is not in favor of free markets. Trump is a mercantilist. Now, you might think that's a good thing, and maybe it is to some extent in this day and age, where if he had his way, the Fed would never have raised interest rates. We would have had much higher inflation than we've had even under Biden if Trump had his way, because at least Biden wasn't browbeating the Fed to keep interest rates down. They properly became worried about the inflation that the Fed caused. But this is where things I think are going to head soon, and it's going to be interesting to watch. I posed a rhetorical question recently in my newsletter, basically asking, is China going to drag the U.S. into a global round-robin currency devaluation? China, which has the highest debt to GDP ratio when you add public and private debt of anybody in recorded history, greater than Japan, greater than the EU, greater than the U.S., they have now showed their hand, and after on and off trying to let nature take its course and allow some debts to go bad, bring back some market discipline in China, they figured out that the problem is so vast and the danger of an epic implosion of their system, which would make 2008 look like a picnic, was so great that they just can't risk it any longer. And so you have seen the Chinese yuan devalue a fair bit recently. There are persistent rumors that there may be a little bit more of an aggressive devaluation in the cards still, because the only thing left now for China to do to keep all the deflationary dominoes at bay is the old, to quote the late Richard Russell, the dean of all of us newsletter writers, it's inflate or die time. So they've uncovered, the easing mode again in China. That is giving them an added export advantage, which is rubbing even more raw relations with other countries. So to the point where you had those tariffs imposed recently. Canada. Apparently, the prime minister is warming up to the idea of being browbeaten by the U.S. that maybe we can't have these BYD vehicles being dumped into Canada and undermining our own efforts at building an EV and battery industry. We're going to have to do the same thing here. The EU did push back and said, no, we're not going to impose tariffs on China, because at least the EU is going to be less hypocritical and say, well, I guess if we don't want to mine all of these things ourselves, we're going to have to let our citizens buy the cheap, electric vehicles, which aren't bad vehicles from China. So we'll see, but this is gonna ramp up these wars, and I'll tell you what, much more so than if Biden were to get reelected. If Donald Trump is elected, that's going to be one of his big hobby horses. Is he's going to want the Fed to aggressively cheapen the dollar, lower interest rates. We will have higher inflation, but in his mind, that'll translate into the U.S. being able to compete better. I don't think he's correct in that. That's an Archie Bunker level of economic acumen that we need more than that right now.
Yeah, the trouble with Trump is he's always been binary. Somebody has to win, somebody has to lose.
Right.
It's never been how do both sides get something out of it. That's not, and it's never been his style. It's his life is measured in winners and losers. And in order for America to win, China has to lose. China, we touched upon the currency devaluation and the possibility that that's going to increase, but they've been on a buying spree. They've been buying lots of gold. They've been buying lots of all sorts of, commodities. When they devalue, if they devalue the currency further, they're going to continue on with this buying spree and continue to stockpile all this stuff, or are we going to see a period of time where there's commodities and no demand because China already has what they need?
That's quite possible. I've raised that possibility. Others have raised that possibility. It makes sense. It's far from unprecedented. China did this very same thing in the last decade, where they went on a big shopping spree. The currency devalued. They sat on their hands for a while, and the pop that had come about in some commodity prices came back down. That may happen again. I don't think that would kill a long-term move for commodities, but I certainly think that short-term, it's going to give traders a little bit of pause. Do you really want to chase, some of these moves that we've seen in the metals recently, when the possibility exists that China will take a break for a while and let things flutter back down at the same time that it digests what it's already done? I don't know the answer to it, Mike. We can only look at probabilities. I have no doubt, if we want to look at one of the biggest stories, I'm doing a panel on this tomorrow morning on copper. I have little doubt that the guys like Robert Friedland and other copper bulls are correct because of the supply and demand fundamentals, which we'll be talking about at this conference. Copper can be $10 to $15 a pound in the next 5 years, but there's a 50-50 chance that between here and there, it comes back to $3 for a while first. If China, if the market reacts very badly to China not buying much, if there's a financial accident there, if recession fears, which have only been minor in the recent past, all of a sudden become acute, you would see a lot of the generalist investors sell or even short copper and other commodities just as a reflexive thing, because that's what you're supposed to do if recession fears have all of a sudden popped up. And the supply and demand won't matter a bit in that context. I'll be continuing to cover that in my newsletter too, because we're, right now, these types of things and these geopolitical struggles and the trade spats and whatnot, it doesn't make it easy to figure out a portfolio mix that you can put together now and sit with for the next several years. There's too many moving parts.
Yeah, there is too many moving parts, and the risks keep adjusting and shifting almost on a daily basis. Yep. as to what's going to happen and progress. But I do think that one of the things that we're going to continue to see is that I think the dominant economic push will still remain in China as it has for the last decade, and it's how not only what happens in China, but how we in the West react to that is going to be how things are going. Now, I've often wondered, we talk about the electric vehicles, and now they've just slapped more tariffs on the Chinese electric vehicles. But I'm wondering if we need to be looking at a made in North America electric vehicle plan instead of saying, okay, we're going to bring in electric vehicles from all over the world. We figure out how many electric vehicles we need and we just build them here.
Well, I have said for a long time, to go back to a couple of things we mentioned earlier in this conversation, that the U.S. desperately needs to dust off the Monroe Doctrine, but not in an imperial way or military way so much as from a benevolent and big brother, but a good big brother. I don't mean the George Orwell big brother, but a good big brotherish type of mode. There is no reason that the United States of America should be worrying about what the border is between Russia and Ukraine, or worrying about whether China and Taiwan get back together nicely or not so nicely down the road, when we have got so many challenges in our own country, in our own backyard, with our own citizens, and with our own economic destiny, as you just posed. There's no way that we should have all of these involvements and worries on the other side of the world, when in our own backyard in South America, which is going to be an emerging economic powerhouse if they play their cards right for the next century, because they've got the lion's share of a lot of these materials we're going to need. No way that China today should have more influence in most of the South American nations and more collaborations over mining and ports and whatnot than the U.S. does, but they do, and they have had for a long time. That is something that, people, the partisan silliness on both sides, Trump should be impeached for this and was, Biden should be impeached for this. No, somebody should be impeached or thrown out of office or worse, because we have allowed not just an invasion physically of our own country, but we have allowed our own hemisphere, our own backyard, to go the way of China. And I don't begrudge China for filling that vacuum. It's not their doing. Okay, it's that we gave that opportunity to them. So we should be redoubling our efforts to make sure in the U.S. that between Canada to the north, where there's also a lot of collaborations that can be done, and many are already, over a lot of these minerals and commodities we need for future generations, and more so Central and South America, we should be redoubling our efforts to make sure that we're running the show in our own backyard. Let Europe worry about what's going on over in their sphere of influence. Let China have their own, world over there. But this is screwed up when we're allowing this attrition in our own backyard within our own borders, and we're worrying about what's going on the other side of the world.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, and I'll throw a little New Orleans shade in here. It's like when the Atlanta Falcons were up 28-3 in that Super Bowl and lost to the Patriots.
There you go. Yeah.
They sat back and figured, okay, the game was won, and we can just skate. And it seems to be America has taken their eye off the ball in a lot of ways.
China and Russia both have, in my view, have shown signs that they do not want a military conflict with the West generally, and with the U.S. specifically. They see that because of the idiocy in the way that policy has been in this country for a long time, and it came about before Biden, but it's gotten worse since then. They don't have to fire a shot, so to speak, because this country is doing itself in. We've taken ourselves out of the global competitive playing field to the point where all we've got left is we're going to build bigger and badder bombs and nuclear subs and everything else and bomb you into submission if you don't play by our rules anymore. That's all we've got. And so those countries don't want to be the ones to fire the first shot for history's sake. They don't want to do it as a practical matter, and they shouldn't have to do it as a practical matter, because they're doing very well in building up bit by bit now the multipolar world of the future, while the U.S. is still in denial that such a thing can even exist. And that really, in that statement, I guess, Mike, sums up our geopolitical challenges and our economic challenges, is that we just do not want to accept the fact in this country that the landscape is changing, that America's run as the global hegemon, which is 80 years plus or minus now. It's dwindling, and it's nearing an end. Doesn't mean we're going to go into the sunset. Doesn't mean that the dollar is going to stop being a world's currency tomorrow, but it means that there's other players out there. And we better figure out the fact that we just can't bomb everybody that doesn't play by our rules anymore. We better figure out how to be relevant, at least to ourselves economically, if not to other nations, real quick.
Yeah, but doesn't that start at the top? Like, realistically, and I'm not American, so I have no say in it, and I want to make that very clear. But your last three elections, and I'm calling the one that's upcoming as part of that. You've had horrible choices to be made for president. In a country of 350 million people, can't you find better leadership to stand forward and say this is what America needs to do, and move forward, rather than what you've had? You've had bad leadership for a while.
Yes, we have. But theoretically, that should be able to be done if we really did have democracy and free choice in the United States of America. But it's very clear to a lot of us that we haven't had for a very long time. You don't have political conventions anymore. You've got coronations of whatever candidate is blessed by the establishment. Somebody that has some ability to break through, like, for example, in this election cycle here, Robert Kennedy, you deny him Secret Service protection. You keep him out of the debates. You don't even let him into the Democrat primary. That was a joke this last time around, when his whole family has been Democrats their whole lives, and when he wanted to run as a Democrat against Biden, that wasn't going to be allowable. So you've got this top-down control that profits, whether it's a Biden or a Trump or Hillary Clinton or whoever the sainted two-party candidates are. And it's really a uniparty. The Republicans and Democrats, by and large, are all the same. It's all about maintaining the global empire. It's all about keeping the military-industrial complex fat and happy, and keeping their jobs and keeping the lobbyists sending the checks in. That's unfortunately what drives things in the U.S. So it doesn't serve the people here well. It doesn't serve the world well, and it makes the world a very dangerous place when these people who control both Biden and Trump would rather, I forget which Chinese philosopher it was that said this, but the U.S., and this is what scares me, and I don't have any great pride in saying this as an American, but clearly the U.S.'s attitude right now is they would rather blow up the world and rule over the ashes than allow the American empire to be taken away from them, and they'll do it.
Yeah, but every empire, the Romans were the same.
Sure.
The Brits were the same. People in charge don't like to get, not be in charge anymore.
No. And so in a roundabout way, to answer your question, no, we're not going to be allowed to have better choices, because any better choice is going to try and do something. I mean, the only reason I voted, I would say the chief reason I supported Trump when he ran the first time was because I took him at his word that he was going to put NATO into the dustbin of history where it belongs. He was going to bring Russia back into the Western orbit where it naturally belongs, not as an ally of China, but as an ally of Europe and a trading partner of Europe and America, et cetera. And instead of doing that and gutting the military-industrial complex in a deep state, he fed it more than any president before him. And the only one who has outdone him since is Biden, where we knew he was going to do that. But Trump led everybody down the garden path. Now he's trying to tell us he's going to fix things again. He's trying to tell us, when I selected Mike Pompeo and John Bolton and Reince Priebus as my main political, I didn't really know them. I hadn't figured it out yet. But trust me, now I know. Give me a break. Tell me another one. You're the smartest businessman that God ever put on planet Earth, and you didn't know what John Bolton was before you nominated him? You didn't know what Mike Pompeo was, and Nikki Haley and some of these other warmongers? You didn't drain anything. You rearranged the alligators in a swamp. And you want us to believe you're going to do now in a second term, if you have a second chance, you're going to do what you said you'd do your first time and didn't do it? Give me a break. I mean, look, this will sound cornball to some people or crazy, but there's a guy, and I can't remember the name of it. Maybe you've seen me when I posted this. I mean, there are people who sincerely believe that Trump is controlled opposition put up by the establishment, that he's out there to get all of the MAGA people and all of the people that believe in traditional values and that America should have strong borders. You know, he's our hope. He's the second coming of Jesus and George Washington rolled into one. And boy, if we only get behind him. But you look at the guy, and apart from his personal peccadillos, which I don't care about one way or the other, just as a matter of policy, just as a matter of leadership, just as a matter of common sense. Sure, he has some good things he says. Sure, he has some good positions. The guy is not, in my opinion, a leader. The guy does not have properly formulated solutions to the problems that we have, as much as a lot of people think he does. If you put a gun to my head, and made me choose, I'd probably choose Trump over Biden. It'd be less bad in some ways. But again, back to your original question, why should I even have to settle for that choice?
Well, that was kind of my point to that discussion. It just seems to me it's like, you know, you're not voting for a good leader. You're voting for the least offensive choice, and it's a matter of which those are. So, last thing before we wrap this, then. So, if China is going to devalue their currency, what does the Fed do? Like, are they going to have to follow China down the rabbit hole? Because, as we talked about, Canada breaking himself of being a petrodollar, if you continue to follow China down the rabbit hole, are you not devaluing your dollar and bringing inflation back? Or I guess the other choice is you could ignore that, your dollar value goes up, and your buying power goes back, and the people that are hurting from inflation will start to see a benefit from that. So
I think in the end, and this is probably since we've rambled on so much, well, I've rambled on so much today. We'll have to revisit this, but I think that when the choice becomes more acute for the Fed, they will take the China option, and that will be to devalue. And they will find some excuse to have to do it far short of meeting their 2% inflation goal, which I've said all along anyway, that there's no way in hell, short of a depression, that we get back to 2% inflation. Even if we do, it's going to be brief because there's too many other forces going in the other direction, not to mention the laws of mathematics. So I think we ultimately will get dragged into it. The question is, how does the Fed sell it if it's a choice that they can take a little bit of time to make? Or worst case scenario, even with China trying to inflate, there could still be an accident in the markets that causes a lot of dislocation and deflation in the markets. And then that answer, that question answers itself because the Fed, as they always do, will ride to the rescue if it's a market event that brings this question on. So one way or the other, in the end, the Fed will have no choice but to join in this devaluation. They cannot allow the dollar to go on in a relentless rise higher, because then that screws up too many things in the world, from emerging nations being able to pay or even service their dollar denominated debts to all of the rest of the things that would cause. So no, I think we're close to that. I don't think we're going to have to go very many months before we see the Fed run up the white flag. And again, they'll have to figure out how they're going to sell this when they've been so steadfast that they're going to get back to their 2% target come hell or high water. It'll really be entertaining to see what kind of word salad Powell comes up with and what the catchword will be. It won't be transitory. It won't be bumpy. It'll be something else.
Yeah, it'll be that'll be a good when it starts to happen. It'll be a good poll to put out. You kind of answered my last question on this. Say China devalues the currency like we've discussed tomorrow. Does the Fed follow suit sooner or later?
Well, they won't. They'll attempt not to do it right away. And in fact, I think the sales pitch will be that they're still going to be steadfast, and for everybody's sake, not just America, they're going to try and rein in inflation and do away with some of those pressures. But I think that there's too many other reasons why the Fed's going to have to relent too.
For those of you that want to follow Chris's work, how would they do so, Chris?
Simply go to nationalinvestor.com and you can sign up for my free newsletter if you don't already get it. There's paid membership information to get all my recommendations, or on Twitter, which is what I spend most of my time on. You find me under @NatInvestor. I guess I should start calling it X since Elon finally got around to changing the domain name too. It's not twitter.com anymore.
X, Twitter, it's all the same. Thank you very much for joining me. This has been an absolute pleasure, and look forward to having you in person again soon. But failing that, Zoom always does work.
Yes, it does. Thanks, Mike.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.